Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. It is time for another American History Reacts video. So this is one I'm very excited about for a couple of reasons. So this is what the US would be like if America lost the revolution, from the Infographics Show. Which is a really interesting question. I think there's an even bigger question actually, which is what would the world be like? And so part of the reason I'm very sort of pro-American, indeed part of the reason I launched this channel, is I think the world would be a substantially worse place if America had lost the revolution. I'm sorry to my my countrymen, but the best side won. But that's possibly a subject for another video. So this is what would the US be like. I think it's going to be really interesting. I do have a specialist history reaction channel if this kind of thing interests you guys. So I'll put the link in the description and the top comment. And without further ado, let's roll the video.
The battles of Lexington and Concord. The opening shots of the American Revolution pitting a scrappy colonial army against the might of the British Empire. It was the...
I love how angry all the British soldiers look. Having said that, also, I think that's probably the kindest depiction of British teeth I've ever seen from an American channel. So, on that basis, thank you, Infographics Show. We're very grateful.
Culmination of years of harsh treatment from the English forces, including the massacre of peaceful protesters in Boston and the tax hikes that led to the Boston Tea Party. And the world watched as the ultimate underdogs, led by George Washington, turned back the forces of Great Britain and created a new country, the United States of America.
Yeah, the USA.
It didn't work out that way. 700 British soldiers had been sent to destroy colonial supplies and cut off the rebellion before it could start. Warning was given by Paul Revere and the other riders of the British arrival. But in this timeline, a stray butterfly spooked the horses of the warning team, keeping them from ever reaching their...
So this is obviously a reference to the butterfly effect, which is the theory that everything is so interconnected that even a tiny change kind of on the other side of the world would have at any point dramatically altered human history, aka the beating of the wings of a butterfly. This is taking it more literally, which I love, and I also love the idea that Paul Revere could have been full butterfly.
Destinations.
British trained butterfly, of course, nothing but the best.
The British swept in and captured the arms caches and arrested the ringleaders planning to fight the British. Prominent founding fathers like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were interrogated by the British, likely disavowing all involvement, but one thing was sure: there would not be an American...
So, one thing I don't know, maybe you guys who know more about his period than I do. What do you think would have happened to the leaders of the revolution if the revolution had lost? So, you know, like the signatories of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, would they have just been imprisoned, or would someone have maybe been executed? Like, judging by how Britain put down other revolts, I kind of think maybe a bit of both, especially because, I mean, if it was a non-white revolt, let's face it, the British Empire would be a lot harsher. But I genuinely don't know. I'd be really interested to know what you guys get taught in America.
American Revolution in this timeline. Under the hard-nosed approach by King George III, the potential revolution...
Put them in prison and feed them tea with no biscuits. So you guys have no idea how offensive this suggestion is. It is like, in terms of punishments we have, it's hung, drawn and quartered, which is where your intestines are pulled out. It's what happened to William Wallace. You get hung, and eventually you get kind of mercy killed. That's the second worst punishment you can get in the UK. The worst is tea with no biscuits. Barbarism.
Had been quelled, and he would likely take care to make sure it never repeated. British troops would maintain a strong presence in the colonies, rooting out any sign of rebellion. George was infamous as the king who had the...
So, ironically, the UK doesn't actually use that much metric. The UK is kind of halfway between the two systems. We use a bit of both. So we do things like milk and beer are in pints. Height is usually done in feet and inches. But we do also use meters and centimeters for some different things. But then for distances in terms of things like cars, we tend to use miles, not kilometers. I mean, the UK is like, if you took a fully metric country, so like a continental European country, and an imperial country, so the United States, and just smashed them together, the resulting mess is basically how the UK is governed.
The harshest approach toward the colonies, spurring increased resistance, but it's likely that after a close call, he might have been advised by those he trusts to hold off on any new taxes for a while. Yeah. After all, the colonies were a valuable resource, so it's likely that the status quo would have remained in place for the next few decades, as long as George III remained in power.
I think, honestly, I think a more interesting scenario, so whilst I find the idea of like a butterfly startling Paul Revere's horse hilarious, I think a more interesting scenario is what would have happened, because in that case, I think it probably would have been something else part of the revolution. I think there was so much anger in the colonies, as we'd already seen from various previous incidents, that something was going to bring it to a head at some point. I think the more interesting scenario is what happens if Britain granted some of the colonists' demands. So, for example, if they received representation in the British Parliament, I guess at that point the British Parliament would be made up, 10% or so by American colonists. I don't know the exact figure, but at that point you'd be politically integrating the 13 colonies far more into Great Britain itself. I don't know if that would have prevented it. Clearly it would have had a huge impact, not only on the 13 colonies, but also on Britain itself, on the governments of both of them. But that seems like a more realistic scenario where you might have prevented a revolution rather than, like one minor event with Paul Revere falling off his horse or getting lost or something. But yeah, it's interesting.
And that would be a while. George III has a reputation of being a bit of a disaster, but he was actually the longest reigning king in British history, serving for almost 60 years. His successor, George IV, was seen as a dilettante who only reigned for 10 years. Selfish and irresponsible, his reign was heavily influenced by his advisors, and as such, it's likely they just would have advised him to keep things going under his father's colonial policies for the term.
I don't know why, it's making me think of Boris Johnson, like the crazy hair, loves to party.
After all, there were parties to attend back in London.
Yeah.
But back in the colonies, things have changed a lot. Many of the founding fathers who defined the march to independence have since passed away, with Franklin and Washington likely not having anywhere near the influence on history they...
The really interesting question with George Washington, so what George Washington served in the 7 Years' War, what you guys call the French and Indian War, in the British Army, or rather attached to the British Army. And what he really wanted was a commission into the regular British Army, and he was repeatedly refused for various reasons, and him being a colonial was probably one of them. So there's an interesting question of what would have happened if he'd been given the commission he sought. It's a sort of fascinating alternative history.
It did in our timeline. However, it's likely an independence-minded movement continues in the colonies, focused less on fighting for independence than on developing the colony's culture, and they have a lot of room to do it in. While the original United States post-revolution was only composed of 13 colonies, the British territories they're part of now are much larger, including much of what's now Canada, and the crisis happening in another country might be as big a factor as what's happening in England. While the American...
So the Canada thing I think is really interesting, because the American Revolution was obviously huge in creating American national identity, but it was also very huge in creating Canadian national identity as something distinct from being American. The leaders of the American Revolution hoped that the Canadians would rise up and join them. Now, that didn't happen for various reasons. The French Quebecers, for some reason, decided they would prefer to be under British control than American control. But what was really key is after the Revolution, tons of loyalists went from the 13 colonies to Canada. And that then solidified British control over Canada. And so if there hadn't been a revolution, the idea of Canada and the United States as separate entities may not exist in the way it does in our world.
The American Revolution didn't happen in this timeline. Odds are another revolution did. The French Revolution. The circumstances there were primarily driven by poverty and populist rage against an out-of-touch monarch.
So this is true, but I would also add that the expense that France paid during the Revolutionary War was a big reason why the French economy was in such a terrible state at the time. And the American Revolution, I think, was definitely the inspiration for the French Revolution, for better or worse.
And while it's possible that the American events helped to influence it, they also quickly spiraled out of control, and the Americans who supported it in our timeline were rather ineffectual at pushing it in their direction. And some were even imprisoned for their efforts. So odds are that Danton and Robespierre still rose, and the king and Marie Antoinette still wound up facing Madame Guillotine. And the Reign of Terror still sent France into chaos until it fell, leading to the rise of Emperor Napoleon. And that would give Britain the leverage it needed. France and Britain have long been bitter enemies, and in our timeline, both southern empires declined significantly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Britain saw itself lose its colonies, while France lost much of its territory to Britain in the 7 Years' War. That gave Britain a dominant foothold in North America, including control of the French-speaking territory of Quebec. So, with France relegated to rump territory in the continent and dealing with political upheaval, odds are that Britain would have been able to take America's place in the Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s.
That's probably true, but it probably would have been done by conquest, not by purchase. I can't see Napoleon actually selling land to the British.
Giving the country near total dominance of North America with only Spain to oppose it. But the dominant country would be able to face a major challenge. The United States' history was largely one of expansion for most of its first 70 years, but a major crisis was brewing: slavery. The new country chose to keep the oppressive institution to appease the southern states, although it did abolish the slave trade in 1807. This just led to it creating harsher rules to keep its enslaved population in perpetual bondage. It wasn't until the 1860s, after a brutal civil war, that the United States abolished slavery, and even then it was over a century before the system of racial oppression in the South would be addressed. But in this timeline, things would be very different. You might think that under a colonial power, progress might be even slower. After all, Britain helped bring the institution of slavery to the continent of North America, along with other colonial powers. But actually, the slave trade was abolished in Great Britain the same year as it was in the United States, and pressure continued amongst abolitionist members of Parliament to eliminate the institution for good. The result was that in 1833, Great Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which eliminated the possession of slaves in the country and all territories controlled by it, with the exception of those managed by the East India Company. That included the massive North America territories. So how does this play out across the pond? The abolition of slavery in the UK went relatively smoothly because Great Britain was not an agricultural-driven market. It was a relatively small island nation, quickly becoming a hub of...
Yeah, I mean, the British Empire, particularly in its earlier history, was heavily involved in the slave trade. But generally that was kept off Britain itself. There were very few slaves on the British mainland. It was mainly in the colonies. I mean, not just the 13 colonies, but also the Caribbean, various other places. So the kind of the trauma of the economic transformation from a partially slave-run economy to a non-slave economy was a lot less traumatic for Britain than it was clearly for America.
India. The United States might not have been independent at this point, but odds are its territorial breakdown is still fairly similar. You have the industrialized northern states and the more agricultural southern states, which are making much more heavy use of slaves. And as word starts to spread that the institution might be coming to an end, odds are we'd see some rebellion. And instead of a civil war, it's time for the American Revolution 2.0. Things could have been very different if the United States lost an extended revolution back in the 1770s, but in this timeline it was crushed with relatively little effort by the British.
By a moth!
Means that the
it was a butterfly, wasn't it? Sorry, butterfly, not a moth. A moth wouldn't have a chance.
Colonies would have been allowed to develop at their own pace under the oversight of the Crown, and they likely have all their own governors and local political figures. It's impossible to know if someone who is a governor or a senator in the US would still be prominent here, but there are some figures who are such major players who are so determined to make their voices heard.
So thinking this through, as I say, my leaning is that America was always... I mean, all the kind of comparable parts of the British Empire broke away, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, albeit peacefully in those cases, and kind of step by step rather than in one dramatic violent outburst. It seems logical that America was always going to break away. The only possible alternative being that the American demand for kind of representation, no taxation without representation, if they were given representation in the British Parliament. But eventually that would mean that as Americans expanded westwards and took over more and more land and their population increased, eventually you'd end up in a weird situation where you'd have the British Empire in which America, the American colonies, was by far the biggest component and could outvote Britain itself in the Westminster Parliament. So I don't know if Britain itself would have accepted that, which kind of makes me think that some kind of split was inevitable, and that the idea that you'd have some permanent union would just never work. But I would say, please let me know what you think. I'll be really interested. I am literally just spitballing here.
That it's almost impossible to imagine they wouldn't emerge in any circumstance. And so enters John C. Calhoun into the fray. The fiery South Carolina radical rose to prominence in the United States as the only vice president to lead a rebellion against his own president, supporting South Carolina in a dispute with the federal government over tariffs. He would later emerge as one of the most prominent figures in the lead-up to the Civil War, refusing any concessions to abolitionists and advocating for secession if the institution of slavery was infringed upon. He would die 10 years before the Civil War began, but his fiery speech in Congress is seen by many as the turning point where conflict was inevitable. And in this timeline, the crisis over slavery happened several decades earlier. Instead of being a dying old war horse in 1850, Calhoun is a hale fire breather of 51 in 1833, when the word of the Slavery Abolition Act filters down from Parliament. Odds are he's a powerhouse in South Carolina colonial politics, perhaps even the governor, and he proved that he was anything but shy when it came to opposing the government. So odds are good that when the attempt to persuade the Crown out of passing the bill failed, he would be ready to defy them and try to create the Confederacy 30 years early. But this would be a very different conflict. The map of the country looks a little different in this.
I feel we're definitely going more into kind of, I mean, it's very hard to know what any individual figure would have done in this alternative timeline. So I guess now this is more sort of speculation of one course of events that whoever made this video thinks is plausible.
Timeline, with the much larger territory of Canada joining it. However, it's unlikely that Great Britain would have been quite as involved in the southern border and looking to take territory from Spain. So it's possible that Texas would not be a part of the United States. This means the Confederacy is little more than a rump state consisting of the southern states from Virginia to Florida, against one of the biggest empires the world has ever seen. While in the U.S. Civil War, the two territories were relatively even, with the Confederacy winning key early victories and even making inroads into the North in places like Pennsylvania, the odds are this time the war goes much more quickly, because the British are coming. The early rebellion would likely be fierce and take colonists by surprise. The odds are the southern troops might be able to take some territory to defend their region, because the...
I mean, this kind of assumes that in this scenario where the South rises up, maybe the North would rise up with the South in a kind of independence movement, and you'd just have the Revolutionary War, quite a few decades later, but it would still be the Revolutionary War. And it would just be for explicitly A, for independence, and B, for slavery to some extent in the South, but perhaps Northern as not being. I don't know. It's interesting theory.
North would not be expecting a fight from their fellow colonies. But when word got back to the Crown about what was going on, they would be likely to respond fiercely, while the United Kingdom stayed neutral in the Civil War and even considered giving aid to the Confederacy to weaken their old enemies. This time, the whole force of the British Empire would be bearing down on the rebels, and the man in charge would have a big role.
Rude, isn't it?
George IV passed away in 1830 and left no heirs, so his successor was William IV, his younger brother, and one of the oldest monarchs to ever take the throne at 65. But while he only reigned for 7 years due to his age, he was one of the most consequential kings of the era. A reformer and a strong leader, he approved of the abolition of slavery and also restricted child labor and improved the welfare system. However, he believed in keeping the British Empire strong and would not take well to a rebellion. And the Second American Revolution would go down just like the first. The early successes of the Southern Rebellion would be short-lived, as reinforcements streamed over from Great Britain and delivered arms and soldiers. Any colonial resistance would be met with far superior forces, and the odds are that the Southern slaveholders would suffer heavy losses early on. William IV would perhaps offer them a chance to surrender, a wise move, but Calhoun, as the ringleader of the rebellion, would be unlikely to take the olive branch, so his army would go down in flames, and the British Crown would be unlikely to deal as kindly with him as the United States did with Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, bringing an end to the institution of slavery in the American colonies. And from there, things might work out surprisingly well. The path to abolishing slavery in our timeline was bumpy, with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln kneecapping efforts to enforce racial equality and a compromise over a possibly stolen election a decade later, leading to the end of most Reconstruction efforts. This would lead to a century of racial oppression and segregation in the South. But in this timeline, the British would be responsible for overseeing the aftermath, and they would likely keep tighter control of the southern colonies. The aid of the northern colonies in the war effort. I must admit,
I find this a little bit improbable. I mean, in the sense that the other territories of the British Empire, generally, whilst the British Empire did, after being a big part of the slave trade, eventually abolished the slave trade in its empire, it was still pretty racialised. So all the various African nations, the idea that the British would have been better or kinder to African Americans than the United States actually was, I find it a little bit far-fetched. I don't know. I mean, I know that during the Revolutionary War, quite a lot of African Americans fought on the British side because they were essentially granted freedom in exchange. But I find the idea that the British would have been significantly better at reconstructing the South after Confederate rebellion, on less race-based lines, a little bit unconvincing. But
would mean the colonies as a whole wouldn't be punished, but the rebellious territories would likely see a heavier British presence for a long time. And any local officials who aided in the rebellion would likely see themselves forced out of power permanently. But a lot of this would have to do with a new figure. The elderly William IV would be dead by 1837, and he would be replaced by not another king, but by his niece Victoria, in the latest complex succession. Victoria took office at only 18 years old, and her reign was one of the most consequential in British.
I mean, like, I don't want to be harsh to her, but for an 18-year-old, it looks like she's knocking on a bit, doesn't she? But if I look like, I know obviously this is a much older picture of her, but yeah, I like the idea that that's 18-year-old Victoria.
History. She was known as a strong supporter of British expansionism and would reign for 63 years, the longest term of service in the history of the British Crown until the modern day. So, the fate of the colonies would to a large extent be determined by the whims of this woman. Well, sort of. Britain has been a constitutional monarchy since 1688, and additional restrictions on the monarch's power were put into place since. This meant that Parliament has much of an impact on the laws of the time as Queen Victoria, and some monarchs were much more powerful than others. Victoria would inherit a British Empire at its peak, as well as an unsettled status quo in the North American colonies. But the leadership of these colonies in helping to put down the rebellion of the southern states would be in good standing with the British government, and the region would be seen as the crown jewel of the territories. And that means one major question would be brewing. We all know how the United States gained independence in our timeline, but what about Canada? It was a much more sedate affair, with the British territories holding conferences to ask for independence and negotiating an exit from the United Kingdom. There was no revolution, and in many ways the British were ready to...
There were a couple of attempted Canadian revolutions, but they didn't go very well. There were also what were called the Fenian raids, so that they were kind of Irish Republicans who'd settled in America, formed armed groups and tried to take Canada. Again, that was also foiled, but so it was much more peaceful, but not 100% peaceful.
Let it go. They wanted the country to defend itself, to take the financial burden off of them, and many English-Canadian nationalists wanted to unify the territories and consolidate their control over French-speaking Quebec. But with no significant tension with the parent country, there was no desire for a hard break. So when Canada became independent, they chose to remain a Commonwealth country and maintain the Queen as their head of state while becoming autonomous in all government affairs. Would the same have happened to the United Territories in this alternate timeline? It is possible, but there are a few things in the way. For one, the United States is much more fertile territory and had many more resources than Canada. Almost doubling the territory gives Britain almost an entire continent to control. But it also means higher cost to administer the territory. The odds are that Victoria and Parliament would be open to these negotiations for independence, but they might drive a harder bar.
Honestly, I think this is probably the most likely outcome, if there was for some reason no American Revolution at all, is that America eventually gains its independence, but possibly unified with Canada. But rather than it being a sort of violent break, it does it in the same way as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, which is a kind of like a gradual process.
Bargain.
Well, the other big question is whether the colonies would hold together. I mean, a big part of the reason the 13 colonies held together, which in some ways is kind of the beginning of the American miracle. I mean, if they'd split up, North America could be fragmented between dozens of countries, just like Europe is. But they stuck together, and I think a big part of the reason they did stick together was they were scared of the UK or possibly another European country steamrolling them or coming back and attacking again. But in this scenario where Britain is not an external threat, would all the colonies stick together? I don't know. The problem is there's so many variables, it's impossible to know.
Wanting preferable trade deals long-term with the new country to ensure access to its resources. Whatever the terms of the deal, odds are they would be preferable to what had been imposed on them by the British Crown as a colony. And so this new country is born into a whole different world. In an instant, the United States of North America was born and became the largest country in the world by sheer space. Containing all the territory of Canada and much of the modern-day United States, it would have the benefits of decades of build-up from the British Empire, as well as the scars of a recent rebellion. But in this time of growth, it's not the only country in North America to benefit. With the American Revolution never happening, Spain likely had the Southwest mostly to itself. Without the boost of the American Revolution to the hopes of the colonized countries worldwide, Would Mexico have successfully won its own war in 1821? The Magic 8 Ball says, outlook cloudy. So it's possible that the Southwest North America would still be dominated by the Spanish crown, holding not just Mexico, but most of what's the American Southwest today. So is another war brewing? Probably not. While the territories of North America did eventually gain independence, they're all...
Honestly, I don't agree with that. I think that if the United States of America emerged in some form, in its kind of current form, so if it's not through violent revolution against the British, if it was gradually granted independence, but if it was still democratic, I don't think it would have been able to share a continent with the very repressive, very, very conservative Spanish Empire for that long before there was conflict. I don't know.
Far from abandoned by Great Britain. Instead, they're likely considered extended family, and if someone punches your cousin, odds are you're jumping into the fray. So Spain would be very cautious about trying to take any territory from this new country, and vice versa. While it's possible the two empires could go to war again, maybe provoked by similar events to the Spanish-American War, that would be a much larger conflict and not likely to erupt immediately. So it's possible that Texas and California might never be united with the rest of the territory, but the new country is also very much not in need of extra territory. But this would change a lot of things going forward, including for many of the area's most oppressed people. What would happen to the Native Americans in this new status quo? It wouldn't be all sunshine and roses, since the British, like all colonial powers, were responsible for mass displacement and murder. But certain key atrocities might have been averted. There was never a President Andrew Jackson in this timeline, so there was never a trail of tears. Much of the United States' worst atrocities toward natives happened in the Rush West, which would have happened in a much more orderly method in this timeline. However, the US and Canada shared certain atrocities, such as the residential schools where native children were taken from their parents and forcibly educated to behave more like white people. Those would still exist here under the British and the new...
That's almost certainly the case. I mean, the only kind of other question is that if Britain retained control over its North American colonies, would that somehow reduce immigration from Europe, both from Britain itself and from other parts of Europe? Because obviously a big part of the reason America was constantly pushing westwards was its population growth, driven largely by European immigration. If that didn't happen, maybe you could have ended up with sort of an independent Native American state around, I don't know, the Great Lakes region, for example, or the Great Plains. Again, it's just I'm throwing a theory out there, but I don't know.
Government, but there's hope for a better future. Today, Canada's programs of reparations and autonomy for natives go further than the US, and that might carry over in the Union. But what about the victims of slavery? Well, for one thing, slavery ends 30 years earlier. That's generations of people who aren't born into bondage. The worst of segregation never happens as well, but for the millions of people who become free when
This is where I disagree with the video. I think the British Empire would have been pretty racially oppressive.
Slavery ends, things would likely turn out very differently.
Sadly.
The British control huge swaths of territory in Africa and the Caribbean, and the odds are they might offer some former slaves, especially those taken near the end of the slave trade, the choice to stay in the territory or return to their homeland. It's impossible to know how many would take the offer, but odds are most would not want to be displaced if they had built a life here. So today's country might be an equally diverse place, but one without the century of racial tension that culminated in the growing pains of the civil rights movement. And in some ways, history bends toward the same end. The territory...
Yeah, I don't agree with this. As I say, please let me know in the comments. It's an interesting theory, but judging by how the British Empire behaved in pretty much every other country it was involved with, so in Africa, and particularly South Africa, in Rhodesia, what is now Zimbabwe, in Kenya, they essentially have white-led caste systems. Same with Australia, New Zealand, India. It seems unlikely to me that America would have been different had it not left the British Empire.
It eventually gained independence.
As you know, it seems unlikely that America would have escaped the kind of the race-based elements of the British Empire.
But with much less bloodshed, and most of European history proceeded apace, including eventually the World Wars. The growing tension between Germany and the rest of Europe would still have happened, but with one big difference: the closer ties between the nation taking up most of North America and its former colonial power. In our timeline, Britain was largely left alone to fight the German-aligned forces sweeping across Europe for the first part of both wars, and it took major provocations to get the United States involved. A dirty German-Mexican deal the first time, and Pearl Harbor the second. But this time, as a Commonwealth nation, we likely would have been eager to get involved and help Great Britain. Canada entered both wars long before the United States, and the added forces might have helped win World War I, and potentially ended Hitler's reign several years before the Allies were able to in our timeline. Which then raises the question, would it have been better if the United States didn't win its independence by revolution? It's unlikely that Britain would have kept the colonies forever, and even far-flung colonies like Australia gained their independence peacefully eventually. Part of this was the natural decline of the British Empire, but many countries were able to negotiate for an exit and the benefits of Commonwealth status without conflict. Some countries weren't so lucky in the modern era, including Kenya, which fought a difficult battle for independence in the 20th century.
But this is the Mau Mau movement. It's called the Kenyan Emergency. There was a whole series of colonial wars after World War II during the kind of the process of the British Empire falling apart. But we don't call them wars, so we call them emergencies. So there's the Aden emergency, the Malaysia emergency, the Kenya emergency.
But a country largely seen as an extension of Britain would have had an easier go. So what would the country look like now? Well, for one thing, it would be the largest country in the world. Combining Canada and the United States makes it larger than Russia. And while there's no guarantee that it would have all the territories in the Southwest by now, it's likely to have expanded somewhat. Both the United States and Great Britain are strong economies, so this new country would have had the same strong infrastructure to build off. Of course, not everything would be sunshine and roses. All of the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States still have problems with the treatment of non-white residents in their countries, and any colonial power will be dealing with its past sins for a long time. But it would likely stand alone as the world's greatest power. The United States is arguably the world's only superpower today, but the odds are good that Great Britain would have had much more power and influence than it does in our timeline. An early victory in World War II, thanks to North America entering earlier, would have given Britain a stronger hand in negotiations post-war, and it would have kept many of its colonial holdings, while the anti-colonial movement would have continued.
Yeah, it's an interesting theory. As I say, I'm not 100% on board. My feelings are that if the United States had, in some way, remained part of the British Empire, I think that America generally was a very big force pushing kind of individual liberty and democracy, and that a lot of other countries adopted it because of the success of the American system. So if America had been much more imperial and sort of stayed closer to the empire, and presumably had a much more authoritarian government, that might not have happened. But yeah, I don't know.
And they likely would have given many of them independence. It might have been a smoother process. After all, their biggest colony wound up gaining independence peacefully. The only thing we know for sure, if the American Revolution didn't happen, there likely would have been a lot more tea and tears in North America when the Queen passed away.
Yeah.
Want to know about some other historical hypotheticals? Check out Hitler's plan for the world if he won.
Okay, so generally that was really interesting. I don't agree with all the conclusions, but honestly, I think it's kind of like impossible to predict what would have happened. And it's just a sort of fun, interesting, a fun look at alternative history. But yeah, no, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please do comment below what you think would happen. Genuinely really interested. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. It really helps the channel. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you. Oh, and my history channel. Go check that out, please. Only if you like history.